Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Little Brain Campaign. If you are new here, thanks for joining us. And if you are someone who's been listening for a while, thank you so much for coming back again and again. I'm doing something a little bit different today. Instead of having a guest, I decided to talk about something that if you've been a listener for a while, you've heard me talk about before, but I think it's so important. And that is social media, smartphone use, screen time in general in young people. And I'm adding on a little content about cyberbullying as well. So I'm actually giving this talk at a school later this week. And I think it's nice, even though I've talked about this a lot in past episodes here and there, it's nice to kind of get all of this information condensed into one episode. So I'm basically going to be giving y'all the presentation that I give at schools and businesses locally here in the New Orleans area. Okay, so without further ado, social media, you have to remember, is a business at the end of the day. Okay. So social media platforms need to generate revenue. They have shareholders that they are indebted to, and they need to produce a profit. Okay. So even though we all hear from social media companies that their purpose is to connect people, that's really not the case. Okay. Their purpose is to make money, and we are the way that they generate this profit. Okay. So here's some numbers that are from 2021. So, most likely these numbers are a lot higher now in 2025. So, social media companies in 2021, especially Meta, Facebook, and Instagram, generated about almost $74 billion in ad revenue just for that year. Okay. The average American adult spends about 2.5 hours per day on social media platforms. I will give you the stats for teens and children later, but it's a lot higher than that number. And the average number of users in the US across all platforms in 2022 was a little over 302 million. So that is a lot of people, a lot of eyeballs, a lot of profit. Okay. Social media platforms were really smart in that they realized that they could produce a ton of profit with almost no overhead whatsoever, very little overhead. And the reason is because we, the users, are the ones who are creating the content. Okay. So my partner in the talks, social media talks that we give at school, is Mariana Boyd, who was just recently on the podcast. She always explains that, in traditional media like newspapers, you would have a whole staff of people creating content. You would have writers, editors, you would have photographers, you would have the publishing department. So, this whole staff of people that the newspaper had to pay to create content. However, now with social media, we're creating free content. Okay. This costs the social media companies nothing, and they make a ton of money off of it. All right. Something else that's really important to remember is that when we use social media platforms and just our smartphones in general, we are providing tons of data about ourselves, and data is the most valuable thing in the world now. Okay. And then we know, this is no surprise now, that social media and smartphones are designed in very specific ways to keep us locked in for as long as possible. Okay. So they tap into our reward pathways in the brain to keep us locked in and engaged, because the longer we are engaged, the more money we make for these platforms. Okay. So, a lot of people will ask, how did we get to this point so fast? Okay. Where, we have this wildly addictive technology in our hand. Okay. Especially when we're seeing this in the hands of kids and teens. And the problem is that the technology evolved so fast that it far outpaced any kind of public awareness, public policy medical research. Okay, so public policy change and research happen very, very slowly over really long periods of time. So there's just no way they could catch up with the advances in technology. And we're seeing now, we have all of this research coming out about what negative mental health and physical health consequences we see from social media and smartphones. But social media and smartphones have been around for quite a while now, so we've already done a lot of damage. And I'm sure we're going to see the same thing happen with AI, that it's evolving so rapidly. Unfortunately, it's going to be a very long time before we see what are the positive or negative effects of AI on our mental and physical health. Okay, so that's the issue. Technology just evolves way faster than policy and research do. Okay, so just to give you some statistics on how much kids and teens are using smartphone social media. Okay, so this data is from the Pew Research Center from 2023. So these numbers may be a little bit higher now. And they were looking at teens from 13 to 17-year-old. Okay, YouTube was the most widely used platform among teens. About 9 in 10 teens used YouTube on a regular basis. 63% were using TikTok, 60% Snapchat, 59% Instagram, and then 1 in 5 teens were on either YouTube or TikTok almost constantly every day, even during the school day. There's a nonprofit organization called Common Sense Media. If you haven't checked them out before, please do. Very accessible information. They really break down the research studies to make them more digestible for people. They did a study in 2021 where they were looking at screen use for entertainment purposes. Okay, so not for educational purposes. Over the course of time from 2015 to 2021, and they charted it out for teens and then for tweens. And what they found was that there was a very slow, gradual increase in screen use per day from 2015 to 2019, and then a really sharp jump up after that, okay, which I think everybody knows correlates with the pandemic, okay? But what I think is so staggering about this information is the number of hours that we see the average tween or teen using screens. Okay, so in 2015, the average tween was using screens for entertainment purposes only, not for education, 4.5 hours per day. The average teen was using them 6 hours and 40 minutes per day. All right, so you got to remember an average, okay, is just like we're taking all of these data points and averaging them out. So there's so many teens or tweens that are using screens far more than this per day, okay? What's really shocking is the numbers in 2021. So the average tween was using screens 5.5 hours per day for entertainment use only. And the average teen, it was 8 hours and 40 minutes just for entertainment. It's hard to believe they even have that number of hours per day to do this. It's pretty shocking. Okay, now we're several years after that. So who knows? They haven't released those statistics yet. At least Common Sense Media has not. Okay, so who's at risk for excessive use of screens in general, all right? So girls are more at risk for using social media excessively. I think that makes sense. It's tapping into, what is important to girls developmentally. Girls, are more relational creatures, and social media really taps into that, okay? Boys are at a higher risk for using video games and pornography excessively. Any kids who are using screens for some purpose other than learning are at a higher risk of using it excessively, okay? And then kids who have ADHD and kids who have social anxiety are also at a higher risk for using screens excessively. Okay, so this data that I'm about to talk about is from a study called the ABCD study. So this was a longitudinal study that was done from 2015, just ending this year in 2025. They started by watching 9 to 10-year-olds and then followed them through the course of those 10 years. Okay. And this was at several sites all across the country. And they were studying all kinds of things. Okay. So all kinds of data points with regards to physical health, environmental factors, education, and part of it was also looking at screen time. Okay. So even though the study just recently finished, they've been extracting data from this the whole time and publishing it. And you can actually go online and read these studies. So if you just Google ABCD study, longitudinal study, you can get to their website. I will tell you that the research studies are dense and they can be very difficult to read, but you can at least get to the discussion part at the end of the study to kind of get a feel for like what did they find, because the actual meat of the research paper is pretty hard to read if you're not familiar with research papers, but some really interesting things. So what they considered to be excessive screen time was over 4 hours per day. Okay, so like just think about how we just talked about from Common Sense Media, the majority of teens and tweens are using more than 4 hours per day. So unfortunately, this is applying to like a huge portion of our teen and tween populations. Okay, so what are the potential consequences of kids and teens using screens over 4 hours a day? All right, so physical health consequences we can see. Higher BMI, lower fitness levels, more frequent headaches, reduced sleep time and quality. That is a huge one that I see in my practice. Okay, I can tell you almost every single teenager I see has pretty significant sleep issues. Okay, whether it's insomnia or just like poor quality sleep, this is a massive problem. It is definitely like an epidemic in our young people. Okay, some behavioral issues that we see as potential consequences from excessive screen use. Severe conduct issues, oppositional defiant behavior, issues with attention, impulsivity, hyperactivity. So some symptoms that we could see in ADHD, okay, but are actually coming from excessive screen use. And then we look at, what are the potential mental health consequences? All right, so we see higher rates of OCD, especially with excessive use of video games. Okay, so this is definitely going to hit our boys harder than our girls, because if you remember back a few minutes what I said, that boys are at a higher risk for using video games excessively. Okay. We see higher rates of disordered eating, anxiety, shyness or social anxiety, excessive reassurance seeking. So just like to talk about that for a second, this really makes sense. The whole, one of the whole things about social media is that you're constantly seeking validation from other people with likes and follows, okay, and shares. So, kids who are using this excessively, their brain is kind of like rewired in a way to constantly need that external validation, and that crosses over into the real world too. Okay. We see higher rates of loneliness, depression, suicidal thoughts, emotion regulation issues, lower self-esteem, higher stress levels, issues with inhibition, so like controlling impulses, higher addiction potential. That's not just addiction to screens, but that carries over to addiction to other things. Okay. Lower academic performance and lower life satisfaction levels. Okay. So some things that I see in my practice that aren't always necessarily reflected in the research, probably because these are things that are kind of hard to research. So I see this real emphasis on what we call the sick role. And this is something that a lot of other mental health providers have talked about. Okay. And there's been editorials and essays about it. So what is the sick role? Okay. So basically this is people who are either claiming illness or exaggerating illness to try to get attention from medical or mental health providers. Okay. So, when you think about this, like on TikTok, okay. So I think a lot of us have seen over the past few years how there were these certain hashtags for like hashtag for autism or hashtag for ADHD or hashtag for tics. Okay. And people would post videos of themselves, displaying whatever symptoms they had of these conditions. And, over time, like the more severe you present these symptoms, the more likes you get, the more follows you get. Okay. And so it encourages this pattern of people trying to like one up each other, basically. Okay. There's a lot of concentration on diagnoses and labeling diagnoses. And unfortunately, there's often not enough focus on what are things that you can do to be mentally well. Okay. What are like the lifestyle changes and behavior changes that you can make to support your mental health? Okay. Young people, we know this from Jonathan Haidt's book, right? That they're interacting more via screens, and there's what we call an opportunity cost with that. Okay. So something is being lost, and often what that is interactions in person. So they're interacting more via screens, less in person. We do see this as something that's kind of a silver lining, I guess I would say, is that there's been delays in the age at which young people are drinking, using drugs, but then we're also seeing a lot of delays in other major milestones. Okay. So if you have a teenager or you've had a teenager recently, you may notice that like a lot of teens don't want to get driver's licenses anymore, which is kind of crazy to think about, because I think most of us, when we were teens, couldn't wait to get our driver's license and get behind the wheel and get out of the house and away from our parents. But now this is really not happening at the same rate that it used to. I also see a lot of young people not getting jobs anymore, whether they're teenagers or college students. A lot of them are, going through high school and college and then graduating college without ever having had a job. And so they don't have that life experience, which can be a huge detriment to them. We definitely see with adults, and we all know this, we've all seen this, there's such a huge influence of social media on our social, our political, our economic beliefs. Okay. And so we have to think like, what is that doing to a young person whose brain is not fully developed, whose frontal lobe is not fully developed? Okay. We know that social media algorithms are going to feed us content that either agrees with us, or more often content that is in direct opposition to what we believe, because they know that negative content gets more interactions, and that that negative content fuels us to be more engaged in the social media. Okay. So the more content we see that's in opposition to what we believe, the more that we interact on social media or get engaged. And that actually just entrenches us further in our beliefs. Okay. So it's making it harder for us to be empathic and like see other people's points of view and challenge our own beliefs and be open-minded. Something else I see that seems like it might be trivial, but it's actually really important. Okay. I find that kids and teens and young adults don't have hobbies and interests anymore like they used to. Okay. And why is that? Because they're never bored. They never have an opportunity to be bored. There's always something that they can fill their time with, and it's usually on a screen. Okay. Those screens are hitting our reward pathways. All right. So, like our dopamine receptors at such a high frequency, and so significantly, that it's hard to find something else, anything else that can replicate that. Okay. Beyond like skydiving. Right. So it's hitting that reward pathway more than a lot of drugs do. So, if you're so constantly stimulated by the screen, the social media, then your brain is not going to be stimulated by things, by little hobbies and interests as much. Okay. So I see this as a huge problem, because as they go into adulthood, if you don't have those hobbies and interests, those things that like bring you joy and bring you into that flow state, then you can really struggle with finding pleasure in life, finding joy in life. Okay. Feeling fulfilled and feeling content. Okay. So let's talk about eating disorders and social media for a minute. Okay. Excessive time online in 9 to 14-year-olds led to a higher risk of eating disorders. Okay. So a lot of worry about weight gain, tying weight to self-worth. engaging more in what we call compensatory behaviors to try to prevent weight gain, like restricting your eating, purging, using things to like laxatives. Okay. We also see higher risk of binge eating, okay, and distress over that binge eating with excessive time online. Okay, so depression. All right, so depression and social media. And I'm kind of just like hitting some of the big mental health conditions that we see have like a really significant correlation with excessive screen use or excessive social media use. Okay. So depression. We see the strongest associations with between depression and the following types of screen use: video chatting, texting, watching videos, and playing games online. Okay. So compared to 20 years ago, teens today are 50% more likely to have major depression and 30% more likely to commit suicide. All right. Major depression is what a lot of people will call clinical depression. All right. So that is not just like, I feel sad, I feel down. All right. Major depression is a psychiatric diagnosis. It's not just feeling sad. There has to be several other symptoms involved to meet those diagnostic criteria, okay, like changes in sleep, changes in appetite and eating, an inability to find pleasure and joy in things, feelings of hopelessness, feelings of suicidal thoughts, and a couple of other things. Okay, so that is a pretty significant diagnosis. We don't give it lightly. All right, so a 50% increase in that diagnosis is shocking. Okay, we should all be super concerned about that. So just to tell you about this study that was really interesting, okay, and it's about Facebook, right? So if you remember back to when Facebook was first released, okay, so it was released on individual college campuses at a time, okay, so it was only available to college students, released at like a few at a time, and then gradually spread out to other colleges, and it took a while before it was open just to the general public. Okay, so this actually made a really good opportunity for researchers to see what was happening on campuses before Facebook was released and after Facebook was released on that campus. Okay, so these researchers went back and they looked at rates of depression and anxiety on campus before Facebook was released on that campus and after. And what they found was that there was a 7% increase in depression and a 20% increase in anxiety on those campuses. That is huge. Okay. I want to hop back to, I know I said something about suicide a minute ago, and I do think that this is really important to talk about. Okay. So the CDC tracks suicide rates. And what they saw from 2000 to 2007, okay, in 10 to 24-year-olds was that the suicide rate was pretty stable. Okay. From 2007 to 2017, the suicide rate in 10 to 24-year-olds increased by 57%. All right, so if you think about like what happened in 2007, why was this such a drastic change? This is when iPhones were first released, Kindle, Android. This is around the time Facebook and Twitter went global. Okay, so I don't think this is a coincidence. I don't think anybody thinks this is a coincidence. All right. Obviously, we can't say causation. We can only talk about correlation, but it seems like there's a pretty strong correlation there. Something to keep in mind, okay, because we think like, we know all these bad things, and it seems kind of hopeless sometimes, right? But there's a study that showed that like even tiny little changes can make a huge difference. Okay, so there's a study from the University of Pennsylvania in 2018, and what they found was that limiting social media exposure to 10 minutes per day per platform, okay, so not 10 minutes total per day, 10 minutes per platform per day, resulted in significant reductions in loneliness and depression. All right, so just that tiny little change can make such a big difference for your mental health. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a minute about life satisfaction, because that was something that I had referred to kind of at the beginning, right? How we see lower levels of life satisfaction with young people who are using any kind of screens excessively. Okay. This was a really cool study done in the UK, and they looked at over 84,000 people. So in terms of medical research, that's a huge sample size. Okay. And that's great because, the bigger the sample size, the more accurate the information is in general. Okay. So over 84,000 people aged 10 to 80 years old. Okay. So also a huge age range. And they were looking at the relationship between social media use and life satisfaction. So what they found was that 11 to 13-year-old girls are the most negatively affected by social media. Okay. I think a lot of us have heard about this, that's a super, super sensitive age for social media exposure. Okay. And this is, part of why we see that like wait till eighth campaign. Okay. Because, if you can get past 13 years old before you're exposing a kid to social media, it does reduce their risk of having a mental health consequence from it. Not that it eliminates the risk, but it reduces the risk. Okay. Okay. So 11 to 13-year-old girls are the most negatively impacted by social media use. Higher rates of social media use in that age group, in the 11 to 13-year-old girls, predicted lower life satisfaction scores 1 year later, even if they stopped using. Okay. So if they're using social media between 11 to 13 years old and then they stop, they still have lower levels of life satisfaction a year later. For boys, the most sensitive time period is going to be 14 to 15 years old. All right. So why do we see this difference between girls and boys? I think this really just boils down to normal development, right? So we know that girls are generally going to start going through puberty earlier than boys. Okay. And so, their brain is just in a developmental phase where it's like more primed to be affected by social media in a negative way. Okay. And then boys, they're going to be developing a little bit later. So that sensitive period is going to be a little bit later. Okay. But then what we see is that for both boys and girls, higher rates of social media use at 19 are, again, there's like another wave of lower life satisfaction there. Okay. So the researchers said that, what they think is happening there is that this is the age that most young people are leaving the family home. Okay. Or have just left the family home. Okay. And so they're losing a huge part of their daily support network. All right. And then they're out on their own, and there's a lot of life stressors and anxiety and depression related to that, huge transition in their life. Okay. So they're just more vulnerable at that time period. Okay. So, let's talk about sleep. This is such a huge problem in my patient population, and it's so upsetting to see how common insomnia is in young people, because we know we have so much research about what chronic insomnia does to your body in adults. And it's going to have even more of a negative impact in kids, right? Because their brains and their bodies are still growing. So it's really upsetting to see how common insomnia is, or poor quality sleep in our young people. So higher rates of social media use are associated with a shorter sleep duration. All right. This is like a no-brainer to me, right? Because a lot of these kids, where are they using their phone? In their bedroom at night. Okay. If you're on your bedroom, on your phone in your bedroom at night, what are you not doing? Sleeping. Silencing your phone at night is still not enough if it's still in the bedroom. Okay. That even if your phone is on silent, if it's in the bedroom, it's still causing sleep disturbances. Okay. Part of that is just because your phone may still have vibrations. There may be maybe lighting up from time to time. We all know that our phones are going to send notifications when we haven't been paying attention to them in a while. I think all of us adults see that, right? And that's happening through the night too, because it's trying to engage you again, get you locked back in. Okay. So turning the phone off completely is kind of the only foolproof way to prevent it from interfering with sleep if it's going to be in the bedroom. The other way is just to not have it in the bedroom. Okay. 1 in 5 teens check their phones in the middle of the night. I almost kind of think that number is higher, but that's the number that the research quotes. So what's the best solution for young people? Not have the phone in the room. Okay. This is like my one advice when I give these talks. I'm like, if you can take anything away from this talk, please get the phone out of your kid's room at night. Okay. If I have a teenager come in and they are depressed and they're having suicidal thoughts, I always break down for them with them, like, where is this happening? When is this happening? What are you doing when this is happening? What are you thinking about, etc. I can guarantee you almost 100% of the time, the suicidal thoughts are happening most frequently at night when they are alone in their room on their phone. Okay. And I know it's not easy to take the phone away from a teenager, but if it's between that and them having suicidal thoughts, to me, it's like, that is just such an, I know I don't want to say easy fix because it's not easy, but it's a really practical fix. Okay. Okay. So what about other types of screens? Other than smartphones? Yes, there are other types of screens that are a problem. Okay. So talking about like our younger kids, especially. All right. So going back to that ABCD study that I talked about, that big longitudinal study from 2015 to 2025, starting with 9 to 10-year-old kids, following them over the period of 10 years all across the country. All right. So some data that they found that they extracted about other types of screens. All right. So higher frequency of video entertainment screen use. All right. Most of that's going to be YouTube, is correlated with altered resting state brain functional connectivity. Okay. So it is actually affecting the functional connectivity in the brain. All right. Poor developmental measures that persist over time. All right. So a 9 to 10-year-old that's using video games excessively, and what do they call excessive? Over 4 hours a day. All right. It's going to affect their development in a negative way. And those negative impacts are going to persist over time. All right. The type of screen, and this is something I'm so glad that the research showed this, because this is something that I had been suspecting for a long time before the research came out. And Mari and I have talked about it in our talks. The type of screen, we are finding out now, matters more than the total amount of screen time. All right, this is super important. All right, so if you remember, American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines about screen use, okay, that came out in like the early 2000s. All right. I think a lot of parents know that whole like 2 hour per day or less for kids. All right. So that recommendation was based on research that was done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Okay. There were no smartphones back then. There were no tablets back then. Okay. There were no personal electronic devices back then. So what were they looking at? They were looking at TV. Okay. So 2 hours per day or less of TV, we are now finding, is very different than 2 hours per day or less of a personal electronic device or a video game. Okay. So, I would almost rather a kid spend 2 hours. I'm not going to tell this is my recommendation, but I would almost rather them spend 2 hours watching TV per day than 2 hours on their phone. Okay. Okay. So I told you that, I'm doing this talk later this week out of school, and they really wanted me to focus on cyberbullying also because that's been a big problem at their school. So I'm going to go through some information, some statistics about cyberbullying. All right. So, some data from 2021, all right, 85% of teens have experienced cyberbullying as either the bully, the victim, or a witness of cyberbullying, all right? And all of this data is from either enoughisenough.org or there was one other organization that I got all of it from, and I'm blanking on it now, but all very reputable organizations, okay? Girls are more likely than boys to be both the perpetrators of cyberbullying and the victims. Again, this is probably not surprising, right? So girls tend to have more what we call relational violence, right? So bullying is part of that, but cyberbullying is really fits a lot of, I hate to say, needs for girls, okay, because it can be done more anonymously, right, and not face to face. And more sneakily. And so that is, that kind of lines up with girls' development more in the adolescent years, especially. Rates of cyberbullying increase throughout adolescence for both boys and girls. All right. So the rates of cyberbullying in 15-year-olds are twice the rate in 11-year-olds. Physical appearance tends to be the most common target of cyberbullying. And then 10 to 16-year-olds who accessed or shared either sexual content or images of cyberbullying or violence were 50% more likely to have suicidal thoughts. That's from journal That's from JAMA from 2021. Only 1 in 10 teens will report cyberbullying to an adult. 81% of teens said that they would be more likely to intervene or report if they could do it anonymously. Okay, so we know that the most important thing to adolescents is their peer relationships, and they don't want to stick their neck out there if it risks their reputation or them being the victim of bullying or damages the relationship with someone. So doing it anonymously is going to save them from all of that and increase the likelihood they will actually report or intervene. So what are some interventions that schools and communities are trying to target cyberbullying and reduce the rates? There are a lot of anti-bullying campaigns have been around for a while, but a lot of them are starting to kind of tailor those programs to cyberbullying. And the research is a little back and forth about how successful that is, but it looks like they can reduce the rates of cyberbullying by about 20%. So it's not, magnificent, but it's something. The papers that I read kept stressing that there should be education for kids about potential legal and criminal consequences for cyberbullying, because a lot of kids are not thinking about this. They're so impulsive. They don't have future decision-making capacity because that frontal lobe is not fully developed. And so they're not thinking this could actually land me with a criminal charge, which is a really big deal. Okay. I think we've heard about digital citizenship programs. There's also some talk about social skills training for teens. Something I really like that I wish I could see more is that they've shown is actually really successful is what they call restorative conferencing or mediation between students. Okay, so getting them to come together in person to try to repair, because we all know that it's much harder to bully someone in person face to face than it is to do it behind a screen, right? When you're face to face with someone, you're forced to watch their body language and their facial expressions. And you're going to have different neurochemicals, rise in your body when you're with another person, right? So it's you're more likely to be empathetic to them. So I like that idea of giving them a chance to restore instead of it only being punitive. Okay. So what can parents do? So education programs for parents about cyberbullying. A lot of research is showing that that's one of the most effective interventions that can be done. Okay. So not necessarily the education programs for kids about the cyberbullying, the ones for parents. Okay. And I see that too, when it comes to social media talks, there's a reason why I give these talks to parents and not to kids, and I think all the parents are always asking me can you do one for kids? I'm I can, but I'm going to tell you right now, this is way more effective if I'm going through you because you're the one giving the kid the phone. So same thing when it comes to cyberbullying, that if we educate the parents, we're probably going to be more successful. Okay. I think that schools, if they have the capacity to do this, I think that they should make this mandatory for parents, right? Make this as part of the beginning of the year orientation. Okay. Parents' involvement in the child's technology use in general is one of the most effective ways that we can reduce excessive use, addiction with social media and cyberbullying. Okay. It definitely is more successful if we can involve the teens in that process. So if parents are going to make a technology plan for their home, if they can involve the teen in that to decide okay, what are going to be time limits for these devices? Where are they going to be when we're not using them? What are going to be the consequences if we break these rules? You're more likely to be successful if the teen is involved and you're kind of negotiating in that process. Okay. I really try to encourage parents to get together with each other. Okay. Because we all know that, it's very hard to be the only parent whose kid doesn't have a smartphone in their grade, right? It's hard to be that parent. It's hard to be that kid. All right. This is way more successful if parents can come together and talk about their concerns and review research, maybe have a professional come and guide them through this process, talk about goals that they all have in terms of their kids' smartphone and social media use. and try to come up with some kind of agreements or pledge. The Wait for Eighth campaign has been really successful for this. They have seen that these interventions are way more successful if you can get groups of parents to be on the same page, right? Because then all the kids have the same rules and expectations and boundaries and consequences, right? And so like your kid's not left out in that process. You can't expect 100% of people to participate in that. That's not realistic. But if you can get the majority, you can go a really long way. Okay. I always try to encourage parents, like in their own home, try to think about, does my kid really need a smartphone? Okay. The reason why we all get our kids phones is because we want them to be able to get in touch with us in case of an emergency, or call 911 in case of an emergency. All right. Or we want to be able to coordinate them when like they're at soccer practice and so needs to pick them up and then they need to get to this place. Okay. Or whatever it is. Right. No one is buying their kid a phone so that their kid can be on TikTok. Well, I hope not. Right. I'm not going to say nobody. I hope that's not anyone's like intention or motivation in getting their kid a smartphone, right? Like most parents are not buying their kid a smartphone so that they can be on Instagram all day, right? We want to get them the phone so that they can communicate with us, okay? So we have to think like, what kind of device does my kid need in order to communicate with me? Do they really need a smartphone? There's definitely a wave of parents who are moving away from smartphones, right? Who are either moving to a watch, a smartwatch, a flip phone, or there are some companies that make a phone that looks like a smartphone. It looks just like an iPhone. Okay, like Gab Wireless is one of them. But it doesn't have access to social media platforms. Okay, so there are other options here that we really need to think about. Okay. Technology contracts are super important in a home. Okay. So like before you go down the road of getting your kid a phone, please sit down with them and clearly explain what are the rules, what are the expectations, what are the consequences. Okay. The worst thing I see parents do is they give the kid the phone and they don't have that conversation in advance. And then it's just like almost impossible to reel it back in. Okay. Because it will go south. I'm telling you right now, it's just going to. I don't know very many kids that can avoid the addictive potential of the phone, just like there's not many adults that can. Okay. So you've got to have these conversations before you get the kid the phone. Okay. What device is allowed to be used? Where is it allowed to be used? What are they allowed to use it for? When can they use it? How long can they use it for? Who has access to it? If your kid has a smartphone, you need to have access to it too. Okay. Unfortunately, that's creating another full-time job for parents, and that sucks for us. But like, you have to know what your kids are doing on their phone. Okay. Set really clear expectations, clear rules, clear limits, clear boundaries. You need to make this very clear to kids and teenagers that this phone is a huge privilege. I mean, can you think like how many things did you get when you were 13 that cost over $800? Like, I don't think I had anything like that, right? Like an iPhone is very expensive. Okay. This is a huge privilege. All right. You're giving them a computer, you're giving them an AI device in their pocket. Okay. It's a privilege that can be earned. It's a privilege that can be lost, right? And so you need to have a plan in place, like what happens when they break the rules and they lose that privilege, okay? I've seen some parents do something really cool where they have like a backup flip phone. And if the kid breaks the rules, breaks the contract with the smartphone, they lose it for X amount of time and they get the flip phone instead, okay? Make device-free places in your home, okay? You get to decide where that is. Bedroom, dinner table, etc., whatever's important for you. Make device-free times, okay? Family dinner, bedtime, religious service, whatever that is that's important to you and your family, okay? And then establishing like where do the phones go when we're not using them, all right? I think it's good to have like a holding place for devices, okay? Because that also sets a clear message to kids that like, if the holding place is the kitchen counter or it's mom and dad's bedroom or it's a safe, like you're sending them a clear message that like, okay, mom and dad have access to this device too, right? Some other things, like it's super important that we as adults are modeling appropriate and healthy use of personal electronic devices for our kids, okay? So having time away from devices, time outside, time with friends where we're not looking at our phones, not looking at them at the dinner table if that's the expectation for a family, not looking at them at the restaurant if that's the expectation for the family, right? So research shows, and this is a study that actually just came out this past summer, one of the greatest predictors of kids' excessive screen use is parents' excessive screen use, okay? So if there's something we can do to help our kids, it's us putting the screens down more, all right, and stepping away, which I know is so hard to do. My work is on my phone. My phone never quits. It never shuts up, right? It is really hard to do, to make a conscious decision to step away from it. We've got to do that. It's so important. Okay. I've talked to y'all enough. I hope that this all sinks in. If you guys like these episodes where I'm by myself from time to time talking about a specific topic and going really in depth, please let me know. If you don't like it and you prefer hearing me talk to an expert and just pick their brain, let me know that too. I am open to all suggestions, but I hope that you can take some of this information and apply it to your family and your kids. And thank you for listening to Little Brain Campaign. Y'all have a great day. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Little Brain Campaign podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation, give us a follow on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Please take a moment to leave a review while you're still thinking about it. It really helps grow the podcast, and I love hearing from our listeners. See you next time.